So in other words, if somebody's spending less than $200,000 on a business, I would say you pretty much should not plan on having any financing at all. Try to have it be all cash. If there is financing, a very small amount, no more than 25% of the total cost of the business. Now, as you go up in price, let's say somebody's investing $500,000 for a business, then the government will allow some amount of financing, but I wouldn't exceed 50%. Now, as you get even more expensive, let's say somebody's buying a $2 million business, it might be sufficient for the person to invest $800,000 or $900,000 of cash and finance the rest. So it's basically, the more expensive it is, the more financing they'll allow, but if it's any kind of business under $200,000, $250,000, try to avoid financing if at all possible. And there are some creative ways to do that. For example, and Joanne can talk more about this, but you know, let's say the person's buying a business and they want to keep the owner around somewhat. They can do an employment contract with the owner, so instead of having a higher purchase price, it's maybe a lower purchase price with an employment contract. So that actually satisfies several E2 requirements, particularly the substantial investment one, because there's no financing involved. So if you could think about creatively and involve a business lawyer, there are often ways around the problem of the investor not having enough money to do the deal. All right, so that's number 5. Now we're on number 6. Okay, number 6 is the business that the investor is buying must not be marginal. And I probably get the most questions about this requirement of all of them, because this requirement has to do with employees and profitability. And different immigration lawyers will tell you something different, but I have been doing this a long time, so what I'm telling you is correct, despite what other people might say. Because I tend to be, you know, some people say I'm a little bit maybe more on the aggressive side, but our success rate is we get them approved. So I know it works. So when I'm telling you something is going to work, it really does. Now, the marginal business requirement, what the government is basically saying is a marginal business is one that's so small, it's not helpful to the economy at all. And so the government has 2 tests, and the business has to satisfy at least one of the 2 tests within 5 years. So it does not have to satisfy either test now. It doesn't have to satisfy them in year 1 or 2. It has to satisfy them by year 5. Now, of course, it's going to look better if it satisfies them now or in year 1 or year 2, but it doesn't have to. Okay, now the first test is the business must have the ability to provide more than a living wage to the investor. Okay, now that could be the investor is going to take out a salary, or it could be that there's going to be a profit at the end of the year, or it could be a combination of the 2. But within a 5-year period, the business must provide enough money to support the investor and his or her family. Now, there's no rule on what is enough money to support the investor. I wish there was, because it would be a lot clearer, but there is not. So usually what I tell people is, you know, try to be able to show that the business within 5 years is going to provide you around $50,000 a year or more. That's just, there's nothing in the rules that says that. That's just my guideline from my experience as far as what the consulates are impressed with and what they're not. Now, let's say a person invests in a restaurant here, and in 5 years they're going for an extension at the embassy, and their tax return shows a profit of only $18,000, and they come to me and say, well, what do I do? You know, you cannot add back in depreciation and other owner benefit items the way a lot of people do when they're presenting the business for sale. So just know that when you're talking with people, I like to have the brokers warn them ahead of time. Some of these things that are now being considered owner benefit but not official should really not be carried forward when they buy the business, because you know, you just have to make the profit look better when it comes time to renew the visa for the E2. So that the owner benefit is, or the amount of money that the owner can earn from the business is the first marginality test. The second one is the business must make a substantial contribution to the U.S. economy, and that's basically by job creation. So there is not a requirement to have 10 jobs. There's not even a requirement to have 2 jobs. There's just a requirement for job creation. And the government doesn't specify what is substantial. They just say it's got to be substantial, and we'll tell you whether it's substantial or not when we see it. Again, so here's my unofficial guidance, and what I find most consulates respect this number. I usually tell people that the consulates focus on the amount of wages that are being paid rather than the number of employees. So it doesn't matter if you've got 10 part-time or 2 full-time. I try to tell people, try within 5 years to have paying wages to American workers, U.S. workers, of at least $60,000 or more. When I told you those numbers, 50 for the owner benefit and 60 in wages, those are sort of my minimums. So you definitely want to try to encourage people to have more employees over 5 years. And certainly when you present the application to the consulate, you're going to give a business plan with projections for 5 years. You'd like the projections to be optimistic enough so that they don't end at my minimum numbers in year 5. You want them to try to have those minimum numbers by year 2 or 3 if possible to make it look like the potential is there to be even bigger. Yes?
Just one, we were talking about the assets. The only thing that they consider, I thought they were considering depreciation, amortization, interest, and salary. They don't consider, they just consider the salary of the owner.
For renewals, when they're looking at marginality, you can't guarantee that the consulate's going to take to heart that argument. So it makes it a much more uncertain application if you're trying to present add-backs.
Initially, interest, amortization.
Oh well, remember when you're presenting the initial application, the marginality is all about what's going to happen over the next 5 years. They don't really care about so much what has happened. If what has happened in the past is that the owner only took 10,000 and the rest was, we can explain in the application, yes, but if you look at this, the owner really made 40, and going forward, the new owner, yes. Exactly. For marginality requirement, it's the business plan that's important. Which brings up my last comment on the issue of marginality, and then I'll answer your question, is people always ask me for the perfect type of business, and does it have to have 2 employees at the time that you buy it, or how do we find the right business for an E2? And my advice is always the same, which is I can make just about any business work for an E2. It's got to be something that the investor has a passion for and is really going to be able to develop that business over 5 years. Because as I was just explaining to Celine, the initial application is all about what's going to happen over the next 5 years. So there's an element of trust on the part of the consulates that this investor is going to take a business, even if it's losing money now, they will offer some element of trust that the investor will be able to expand it over 5 years if you present a good business plan that's logical and it makes sense. So we can make just about any business work even if it doesn't have employees, but the challenge is in 5 years, or sometimes with some consulates even less, maybe 2 years, when it comes time to renew the visa, you do have to show that you've really made that business grow and that you have employees and that you have enough income to the owner. And so that's where that passion comes in. You've really just got to make sure that there's a good connection between the investor's skill set and the type of business they're going to buy, because they're going to have to make that business go forward and grow. Ian, question, Jeff?
Just clarifying the difference between hourly paid or salaried employees and maybe 1099 or independent contractors.
Okay.
How do they view that?
Yes. So in terms of consulates, definitely like payroll employees better. Now they don't really care whether the payroll employee is salaried or hourly. In that case, I would just say follow her advice on wage and hour rules. But they prefer payroll for sure. Now, they will also consider independent contractors in terms of whether you're meeting that 6th requirement of marginality. They will consider them, but there's no guarantee that they will honor them as being job creation. So it's always best to have people have payroll employees. And it happens, if it's very customary for the industry to have independent contractors, let's say it's an electrical contractor or a construction company, and it's very normal to have independent contractors, the consulates are generally okay with that. If it's one of those businesses where it could go either way, and I see this coming up with hair salons a lot, where some salons have people on payroll and some have people renting chairs. I always tell the client, you can buy the business and get an E2 if the people there are all independent contractors, but plan over the 5 years of ownership to convert that, and the new people you bring in should be payroll employees. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so we were just on the 6th requirement. We've got 2 more to go. The 7th requirement is that the investor has to have the power to direct the management of the business. So basically, they have to have enough power to control the business. And they have to be qualified to do so. So what that really means is the investor has to own a controlling interest in the business. And generally, that's at least 50% if there's 2 owners. Otherwise, a controlling interest is 51%. So that's the first part. They have to have a controlling interest so that on any company vote, they can control the outcome. And then secondly, they have to have some type of management position within the business, because the government says, we're giving you this visa to go run your business, so we want to see that you're actually going to run your business. Now, they don't have to be president necessarily or the manager of the LLC, but they do have to be involved in the management. So we like to give them some kind of job within the business that they're qualified for. And then we do have to show that they're qualified. Now, that is not a requirement that the consulates are super strict on. So a lot of times, we may deal with a spouse who hasn't been working for the past 15 years, and the question is, can that person get an E2? Will they be qualified? And usually we can make the argument that they may have managed the family finances. They may have been unofficially involved in the other spouse's business and helped with HR and training. So usually we can kind of build a case to show that they're qualified enough to do the business. So that is the 7th requirement. And the 8th and final requirement is not a difficult one in the most cases. The 8th requirement is that the investor must promise to leave if the visa expires. So usually that just involves signing a piece of paper promising to leave. That 8th one can sometimes be tricky, very rarely, but every now and then it can be tricky. For example, if the person has been spending 8 years in the United States already on different visas. And sometimes the consulate can say, are you sure you really just want to stay here temporarily? But for the most part, this 8th requirement does not come up very much. And just to be clear, that once a person gets an E2 visa, they do not have to maintain a residence in their home country. They can sell their house, they can completely separate their ties with their home country. It's not required for the E2 to maintain a residence abroad. All right, now the one other thing I want to tell you about the E2 that can sometimes help you with selling a business is that the E2 is intended for the person that owns a controlling interest in the business. Remember, I said that that person has to come from a country that has a treaty with the United States. But also, the rules allow that E2 company to bring in certain employees if they come from the same country as the investor. Now, this comes up a lot with restaurants. Let's say an Italian family wants to buy an Italian restaurant, but they really need a chef to help them make their food stand out. So the Italian owner can qualify for the E2, but then they could potentially bring in an employee from Italy on an E2 also to work in the same business. And that employee can only work for the E2 company. They can only work for the company listed on the E2 visa. So that special provision for employees is available to management level employees, supervisory level employees, and employees with essential skills. So that might be a chef, for example, or somebody who knows something special about the company's software. So that's something that can sometimes help you sell a business if they know that they can bring in somebody else to help them from the same country.